It all started on a quiet Monday morning. The kind of morning where the sun stretches lazily over the rooftops. The air smells fresh, almost like a promise that nothing bad could possibly happen. The main character, who had always been proud of the neat little home they lived in, stepped outside with a cup of coffee in hand, enjoying the peace that only early mornings could bring. The neighborhood was calm, neighbors were busy with their own lives, and everything seemed perfect. But sometimes, it's in those calm moments that the smallest crack in the normal can begin to grow. As they approached the mailbox, the first thing they noticed was that it looked off. The door was hanging slightly open, as if it had been forced. They frowned and set the coffee down on the porch. At first they thought maybe the wind had blown it open. It had been a bit gusty the night before, and the mailbox wasn't brand new. But then, as they leaned in closer, they saw a small dent along the edge. A tiny scrape in the paint, a mark that didn't belong there. It was subtle, almost easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. Shaking their head, they muttered, "Well, I guess it's just old age, after all." It was only a small dent, and there wasn't anything else obviously wrong. Maybe a neighbor had bumped into it accidentally. Maybe a delivery truck had brushed past it in the dark. These things happened. It wasn't worth making a big deal out of it. They opened the mailbox, retrieved the letters, and went about their morning routine. Though a little nagging feeling lingered in the back of their mind, days passed and life went on. The mailbox seemed fine after that. Letters came and went, and the world moved along like it always did. The morning sun returned, neighbors waved as they walked their dogs, and the quiet calm of the neighborhood carried on without interruption. The main character felt reassured. Maybe they had imagined the dent. Maybe it was nothing. Then it happened again. It was a Tuesday, 2 weeks later. They had just returned from the grocery store, balancing a couple of bags in their arms, when they noticed the mailbox. Their stomachs sank. It was worse this time. The door was bent sharply, hanging awkwardly from its hinges. Letters were scattered across the ground. Some were slightly torn, edges crumpled. The main character set down the bags and knelt, picking up each piece of mail carefully. Their hands trembled slightly, not with fear, but with confusion and frustration. How? How is this happening? They whispered to themselves. They looked around the quiet street. Not a soul in sight. No tire tracks on the ground. Nothing to explain it. They checked the time. It must have happened recently, because the mail had just been delivered. Whoever had done this, they had done it on purpose. There was no other explanation. At first they wanted to chalk it up to some strange accident. Maybe a raccoon? But the marks didn't look like they had been made by an animal. This was deliberate, intentional. The thought made their chests tighten. Who would want to do this, and why? They decided not to confront anyone yet. There was no proof. They couldn't accuse a neighbor without cause. Instead, they reinforced the mailbox the best they could and tightened the hinges. Every night after that, they double-checked to make sure it was secure. Still, a small part of them couldn't shake the worry that this wasn't over. The following week brought more unease. The main character noticed a car that seemed to linger just a little too long near their house. A neighbor, someone who always seemed to be outside at odd hours, gave them a quick, strange look when they waved. It was subtle, almost too subtle to notice, but it made the main character feel like they were being watched. Every time they stepped outside to check the mailbox, a shiver ran down their spine. Something was definitely not right. Then came the third attack. By this point, the mailbox was battered, almost to the point of being unusable. The door hung crookedly, the flag was snapped in half, and letters were crumpled as if someone had stomped on them. The main character felt a mix of anger and disbelief. How could someone be so petty, so mean? What kind of person found satisfaction in damaging someone else's property for no reason? At first they tried to laugh it off. Maybe it's a prank, they said to themselves, forcing a smile. Maybe someone is just having fun. But deep down, they knew it wasn't fun. It was personal. The attacks weren't random. They were targeted, focused. Every week, like clockwork, something was damaged. The mailbox became a symbol of the tension that was slowly building. And every morning when they approached it, their hearts sank a little. Neighbors noticed too. Some asked if everything was okay, and the main character explained lightly, trying not to worry anyone. "It's just the mailbox," they said. But the mailbox was not just a mailbox anymore. It had become a battleground. A small but persistent reminder that someone out there was determined to make their life uncomfortable. The main character began keeping notes. Dates, times, small details they noticed. Was it the way the flag was bent? The way the door hung? The pattern seemed almost like a signature. Whoever was doing this was methodical, careful, and maybe even enjoying the sense of control it gave them. It was disturbing to think about, and it gnawed at them, leaving a sense of unease that followed them throughout the day. One evening, they decided to stay up and watch. Sitting quietly in the living room, peeking through the blinds, they waited. Hours passed. Nothing happened. The street was still, calm, peaceful. But the main character's mind raced with possibilities. Who could it be? A random passerby? A neighbor with a grudge? Someone jealous of the small, quiet happiness they had worked so hard to create? The thoughts spiraled, each one worse than the last. Days turned into weeks, and the attacks continued. Each time, the main character felt a mix of fear and defiance. Fear, because it was impossible to know who was behind it or what they might do next. Defiance, because they refused to let this person win. They repaired the mailbox, reinforced it, made sure it was stronger each time. Each attack became a small battle, and each repair a small victory. But the battle was exhausting. It took time, energy, and mental space. It began to feel like the mailbox was a test, a way to wear them down. Then came a day when something unusual happened. The main character noticed a small piece of paper tucked inside the damaged mailbox. It was folded neatly, almost carefully, as if whoever had left it wanted it to be found. They unfolded it cautiously. There was nothing written, just a single drawing, a crude symbol that didn't make any sense at first glance. It was childish, almost silly, but it sent a chill down their spine. Whoever was doing this wanted them to know it was intentional. They were sending a message. The main character held the paper for a long time, staring at it, trying to understand. There was a mix of anger, frustration, and curiosity brewing inside them. Who was this person? Why were they doing this? And most importantly, how could it be stopped? It became clear that this wasn't going to end on its own. The mailbox had become more than just a place to collect letters. It had become a symbol of the main character's life, their personal space, and the boundaries that someone else was trying to cross. Each attack was a reminder that even in a quiet, peaceful neighborhood, conflict could creep in unexpectedly in small, persistent ways. By the end of that week, the main character had made a decision. They weren't going to let this continue. They weren't going to live in fear or let someone else's pettiness control their life. They began planning carefully, thinking through ways to catch the person in the act, ways to protect their property, ways to reclaim their peace of mind. It was going to take patience, observation, and careful action. But for the first time since the first attack, they felt a spark of hope. The mailbox, battered and dented, stood in the driveway like a small monument to persistence and quiet resilience. Every scratch, every bent hinge, every torn letter was a reminder that life sometimes throws unexpected challenges. But it also reminded the main character that they had the strength to face them. And so, the story of the mailbox and of the person determined to attack it was just beginning. What seemed like a small, almost trivial nuisance had grown into a mystery, a personal challenge, and an opportunity to show patience, cleverness, and quiet courage. The main character didn't yet know what would happen next, but they were ready to face it, one step at a time, 1 week at a time, determined to have the last laugh in a story that had started with a simple, quiet morning and a small, dented mailbox. The next week started with the same uneasy feeling that had been lingering since the first attack. The main character could barely enjoy the morning sunlight or the chirping of the birds. Every step toward the mailbox felt heavier than before. The previous damage had been repaired, but the dents and scratches seemed to leave an invisible mark. A constant reminder that someone out there was watching, waiting. And planning, they tried to focus on their daily routines, making coffee, checking emails, getting ready for work, but the mailbox constantly tugged at their thoughts. It had become more than just a container for letters. It was a symbol of someone else's intrusion into their life. Each morning, they approached it slowly, hoping, just hoping, that nothing had changed overnight. And yet every week, without fail, the damage returned. This week was no different. As soon as they stepped onto the driveway, they saw it immediately. The mailbox had been smashed again, worse than before. The flag was bent sharply, the door barely hanging on, and letters were scattered across the driveway like fallen leaves. The main character's heart sank. How could anyone be so cruel? So relentless? They picked up the letters carefully, as though handling them gently could erase the damage. But it didn't. The frustration bubbled up inside. Neighbors had started noticing the pattern too. Some asked if everything was okay, and the main character would reply, "It's just the mailbox. I'll fix it again," forcing a polite smile. But the truth was, it was no longer just about a mailbox. It was about respect, personal space, and the sheer audacity of someone daring to interfere in their life week after week. Determined not to be beaten, they started paying closer attention. Each attack seemed to have its own rhythm. It was always on certain days, usually early in the morning or late at night. It wasn't random. Someone was timing it, planning it, making sure they could strike and vanish without being caught. The thought made their blood boil, but it also sparked a new determination. They were going to find out who was behind it, and they weren't going to let it continue. Over the next few days, the main character began observing the street more carefully. They noticed little things they hadn't before: cars that lingered too long, neighbors who were suddenly outside at unusual hours, shadows moving in ways that didn't make sense. Each small clue was like a piece of a puzzle, and though they couldn't yet see the full picture, they started to feel that they were getting closer. One evening, they decided to take a walk down the street to clear their mind. It was quiet, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows over the houses. They noticed a car parked a little too far up the road, the driver sitting inside idling. It wasn't uncommon to see cars around, but this one felt different. There was something about the way the driver was watching the houses, glancing repeatedly toward their home, that set off an alarm in the main character's mind. The walk continued, slow and deliberate. They noticed neighbors tending to gardens, some jogging, some walking dogs. Everything seemed normal, but the feeling of being watched lingered. The main character knew that someone was out there, someone with a reason to target them, and that thought made their pulse quicken. They couldn't ignore it any longer. At home, they started thinking of ways to catch the person in the act. Cameras came to mind, but they didn't want anything obvious. They needed something hidden, something that would record without being seen. They spent hours researching online, reading articles about home security, and figuring out the best way to protect their mailbox while still observing what was happening. Every detail mattered. Every small piece of information could make the difference between finally catching the culprit and another week of frustration. The next attack came, exactly as expected. It was early in the morning, just as the main character had suspected, and once again, the mailbox was smashed. But this time, they noticed something new. A small footprint in the dirt nearby, just barely visible in the morning light. It was tiny, almost delicate, like the person had tried to be careful. The main character knelt down, examining it closely. Whoever had done this had thought they were clever, but they had left a clue. They took careful notes, drawing sketches and comparing the prints to shoes they had seen worn by neighbors in the past. The process was meticulous, but it gave them a sense of control. For the first time in weeks, they felt like they were not just a victim, but an active participant in resolving the problem. Each observation, each note, each clue, brought them closer to understanding what they were up against. Word began to spread subtly through the neighborhood. Some neighbors offered advice, some offered sympathy, and some seemed to watch the main character a little more closely than before. It was a strange dynamic, knowing that everyone was aware of the situation, yet nobody could confirm anything. The main character stayed quiet about what they suspected, keeping their observations private. Knowing that any wrong accusation could make matters worse, the attacks continued. And with each one, the main character became more prepared. They reinforced the mailbox further, adding locks and hinges, making it nearly impossible to damage without effort. They placed a small, discreet camera nearby, hiding it in a bush where it could record without being obvious. Patience became their strongest weapon. Every week they learned more about the patterns, the timing, the techniques used by the person responsible. It wasn't easy. Some days, the frustration was almost overwhelming. They would sit on the porch late at night, sipping coffee, staring at the mailbox, imagining the person sneaking around in the dark. They wondered why someone would dedicate so much time and energy to such a petty act. It seemed irrational, cruel, and relentless. Yet, through it all, the main character refused to react impulsively. They understood that any rash action could backfire, that the key was to stay calm, patient, and observant. One morning, the main character noticed another small clue. A neighbor's dog had left prints near the mailbox, but they were different from the human footprints. The main character realized that some of the disturbances might be intended to confuse them. To make it harder to identify the real culprit, whoever was doing this was clever, careful, and perhaps even enjoying the cat-and-mouse game they had created. Despite the mental exhaustion, the main character refused to give up. They began documenting everything in detail: the dates, the times, the weather, condition of the mailbox, the position of every letter. Each attack became a case study, each repair an experiment in resilience. Slowly, a pattern emerged. The attacks weren't random. They were deliberate, consistent, and calculated. Whoever was doing this had a reason, and the main character was determined to find it. The tension in the neighborhood grew as well. Some neighbors whispered, speculated, and tried to guess who might be responsible. Rumors circulated quietly, but the main character ignored them. They knew that speculation could lead to false accusations, and they didn't want to create unnecessary conflict. Instead, they focused on the facts, the evidence, and the small, subtle clues that only someone paying close attention would notice. Then, one evening, a breakthrough came. The main character was sitting quietly inside, reviewing footage from the hidden camera they had set up. They had almost given up hope of seeing anything useful, but when they looked closely, a shadow moved across the frame. The figure was careful, deliberate, and familiar in its shape. It approached the mailbox, bent it, and left, just as they had suspected. The footage wasn't crystal clear, but it was enough. Enough to confirm that the attacks were intentional, and enough to give the main character a sense of empowerment. The realization brought a mix of emotions. There was relief, because finally there was proof. There was anger, because the person had been bold enough to continue week after week, thinking they could get away with it. And there was determination, because now the main character knew they could take action in a way that would be effective, safe, and precise. Over the next few days, they studied the footage repeatedly, noting every detail: the figure's height, the way they moved, even the sound of their steps. Each small observation added to the growing understanding of the person responsible. The main character began forming a plan, carefully considering how to confront the situation without escalating it dangerously. They wanted resolution, not a fight. They wanted justice, not revenge. Meanwhile, the neighborhood watched quietly. The subtle tension was palpable, but no one knew exactly what was happening. Some neighbors thought it might be over, others speculated wildly, but the main character kept their focus. They knew that acting too soon, without full understanding, could ruin everything. Patience had been their strongest ally so far. It would continue to be. By the end of the week, a small sense of control had returned. The mailbox stood repaired and reinforced. Letters once again safe inside. The hidden camera remained in place, recording silently, waiting for the next attack. And the main character, exhausted but resolute, felt a quiet satisfaction. They were no longer a passive victim. They were prepared, informed, and ready. The attacks had not stopped fear from creeping in. But they had taught the main character something more important: resilience. Every bent hinge, every crumpled letter, every small act of aggression had been a challenge, a test of patience and a lesson in observation. They knew the next attack would come, as it always did, but this time they would be ready. And so, the battle continued. Not with anger or rash action, but with careful observation, methodical planning, and quiet determination. The main character understood that patience and strategy were more powerful than immediate reaction. The mailbox, battered and reinforced, became a symbol of endurance, proof that even in the face of repeated harassment, calm, clever, and steady action could prevail. The story of the mailbox, the attacker, and the patient homeowner was far from over. But one thing was certain: the main character was no longer helpless. Every week, every attack, every small clue brought them closer to the truth and to the moment when they would finally have the last laugh. By the time the third week of attacks rolled around, the main character knew that things could not continue the way they had been. The mailbox, once a simple fixture at the end of the driveway, had become a symbol of ongoing frustration, a mark of someone else's interference in their life. Every morning, stepping outside had grown tense, full of anticipation and anxiety, and every time they saw the mailbox, it felt like a silent challenge waiting for them. After carefully reviewing the footage from the hidden camera, a pattern had emerged. The attacks were happening on the same day each week, early in the morning, just before the mail truck arrived. Whoever was doing this was deliberate and predictable, and that was something the main character could use. The camera had captured blurry shadows before, and even though the image wasn't perfect, it was enough to confirm what they had long suspected. These attacks were intentional, not random accidents. With renewed determination, the main character began planning a more focused approach. It wasn't enough to simply reinforce the mailbox or repair it after the fact. They needed evidence, clear, undeniable proof of who was behind this. It had to be done carefully. They couldn't act recklessly, because that could create unnecessary conflict, or worse, put them in danger. Every step had to be calculated, every observation intentional. The first step was upgrading their setup. They bought a small, high-resolution camera that could be hidden easily in the bushes near the mailbox. It was discreet, almost invisible, and would record everything in detail. They positioned it so that it covered the mailbox from multiple angles while remaining completely hidden from view. In addition to the camera, they decided to reinforce the mailbox further. Stronger hinges, additional locks, and a small metal plate were added to make it harder to tamper with. They wanted the next attack to be captured fully, without the mailbox being destroyed beyond recognition. The main character also spent time studying the surroundings. They walked the street at different times, noting patterns: who left their house at what time, which cars were parked where, and even small details like shadows cast by trees or streetlights that could interfere with the camera. Each detail mattered. Every piece of information could help them identify the culprit. They kept meticulous notes, as if preparing for a small investigation. And for the first time in weeks, they felt a sense of control over the situation. Days passed, and the tension grew. The attacker was still out there, still persistent, but the main character was ready. They went to bed each night with a mix of anxiety and anticipation, knowing that soon the person would strike again and be caught on camera. They imagined the moment when they would finally have proof in their hands, the moment when frustration would turn into quiet satisfaction. Finally, the day arrived. Just before dawn, the main character woke up, heart pounding, and quietly prepared to observe. They didn't want to interfere or confront anyone just yet. The goal was evidence, nothing more. The streets were quiet, and the early morning air was crisp and still. They kept watch from inside the house, peering through the blinds at the mailbox, the driveway, and the surrounding area. Every little sound made their heart race. The rustle of leaves, a distant car engine, a dog barking far down the street. Then, as expected, a shadow appeared. The figure approached the mailbox cautiously, moving slowly, deliberately, as if checking to see if anyone was watching. The camera, positioned perfectly, captured every detail. The figure bent the mailbox, twisted the door, and threw the letters to the ground. They even paused briefly, as if to make sure their work was noticed. The main character felt a mix of anger and satisfaction. Here was the proof they had been waiting for. After the figure left, the main character immediately reviewed the footage. The image was clear enough to see the person's posture, the way they moved, and even small details of their clothing. It was not perfect, but it was far more than they had before. For the first time, they had undeniable evidence that these attacks were deliberate and that they knew exactly who was responsible. The feeling was both empowering and surreal. But the main character didn't stop there. They knew that one video, while helpful, might not be enough. They needed a series of recordings, a clear pattern, something that could be presented to authorities if needed. They spent the next week preparing for multiple nights of observation, ensuring the camera was fully functional and the mailbox reinforced. They wanted to catch the person in the act more than once, to remove any doubt about the intention behind the attacks. As the days passed, more attacks were recorded. Each time, the figure approached the mailbox, bent it, and scattered the letters. The camera captured it all: the timing, the method, and the person's mannerisms. The main character studied the footage carefully, taking notes on everything. It wasn't just about identifying the culprit. It was about understanding them, the way they moved, the timing of their actions. Even the way they glanced around every detail told a story. Through this process, the main character also began to reflect on their own reactions. They realized how much the attacks had affected them emotionally: the frustration, the anxiety, and even the small victories in repairing the mailbox. It was a lesson in patience and persistence. They had been pushed to their limits, but they were also learning to remain calm, methodical, and strategic. Every attack was a test, and they were learning to pass it. The main character also noticed that the attacks seemed to be escalating. Each time, the mailbox was more damaged than before. The letters were handled more roughly, and the person seemed more confident in their actions. It was clear that they were enjoying the situation, taking some form of satisfaction in causing frustration. This realization strengthened the main character's resolve. They were not going to let this person control their life or disrupt their peace. By the end of the second week of observation, the main character had gathered a substantial amount of evidence. Multiple video recordings, detailed notes, and reinforced security measures all pointed to a single, persistent attacker. They felt a sense of relief and empowerment. Finally, they had the information needed to take action. They were no longer operating on suspicion or guesswork. They had facts, proof, and a clear understanding of what was happening. The next challenge was deciding what to do with the evidence. The main character knew they couldn't just confront the person impulsively. That could lead to an argument, escalation, or even retaliation. Instead, they planned carefully. They considered involving local authorities, but they also thought about handling it through neighborhood mediation. Their goal was to stop the attacks, recover peace, accountability, without creating unnecessary conflict. One morning, the main character reviewed the footage one last time before taking action. The images were clear, showing the person's face partially obscured, but their posture, clothing, and mannerisms unmistakable. The evidence was irrefutable. They felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that patience and careful observation had finally paid off. The frustration and anxiety of the past weeks had not been in vain. With the evidence secured, the main character took a few precautionary steps. They made backup copies of the video, documented every incident in writing, and ensured that the mailbox was fully reinforced for the next week. They wanted to be prepared for any final attempt by the person to continue their attacks. This time, they would be ready, and the next attack would mark a turning point in the story. In the meantime, the neighborhood continued its quiet rhythm. Unaware of the careful investigation taking place behind closed doors, the main character maintained a low profile, observing, documenting, and preparing. Each day brought a sense of anticipation and cautious hope. They could feel that the situation was approaching a conclusion, that the moment when justice would be served was drawing near. Throughout this process, the main character also reflected on the lessons they were learning. Patience, observation, careful planning, and emotional control were all crucial. They realized that reacting impulsively, letting anger or frustration dictate actions, would have been a mistake. Instead, they had used logic, careful monitoring, and persistence to gain the upper hand. The experience was frustrating and exhausting, but it was also empowering. By the end of the third week, the main character felt a quiet sense of victory. They had turned the situation around, moving from victimhood to control. The mailbox, once a source of anxiety, had become a tool for strategy and observation. The evidence they had collected was undeniable, and they were ready to take the next steps. The person responsible for the attacks had been caught in the act. Repeatedly, and the main character knew that the next phase would bring resolution. And so, the story of the mailbox and the persistent attacker reached a crucial turning point. What had started as a small annoyance had grown into a careful investigation, a lesson in patience and a demonstration of quiet strength. The main character had faced weeks of frustration and anxiety, yet they had emerged prepared, empowered, and ready to reclaim peace in their life. The mailbox, battered but reinforced, stood as a symbol of resilience. The hidden camera captured every future movement, ready to document the final attempts of the attacker. The main character, no longer anxious, but focused, understood that the next steps would be decisive. With evidence in hand, patience mastered, and strategy in place, the story was moving toward its resolution. Finally, the main character felt a calm certainty that justice would be served. They had endured, observed, and learned. They had turned frustration into action and helplessness into strategy. And when the moment arrived to confront the person responsible, they would do so with proof, clarity, and control. The last laugh they knew would be theirs. The main character had spent weeks observing, documenting, and preparing. The frustration of repeated mailbox attacks had slowly transformed into determination and focus. They had learned to stay calm, to notice the smallest details, and to prepare carefully for each new attack. But now, with a series of video recordings, detailed notes, and a reinforced mailbox, they felt ready to move from observation to action. The first step was to decide how to approach the situation. Acting impulsively was not an option. The person responsible had been careful, patient, and deliberate. Confronting them without evidence could backfire, leading to denial, argument, or worse, escalation. The main character wanted resolution, not conflict. They wanted peace restored, and they wanted it to be clear that the attacks were not acceptable. After reviewing the footage one last time, the main character realized the time had come to involve the authorities. The recordings clearly showed the person damaging the mailbox, and the pattern of repeated attacks demonstrated intentionality. This was not a minor accident. It was harassment. They prepared a file containing all the video recordings, notes on the timing of attacks, and photos of the mailbox before and after each incident. Everything was organized clearly so that when they presented it, there could be no doubt. On a quiet Tuesday morning, they contacted the local police department. They explained the situation calmly and logically, emphasizing the repeated nature of the attacks and the evidence they had collected. The officer listened carefully, taking notes, and asked a few questions about the timeline, the method of documentation, and the location of the hidden camera. It was a thorough conversation, but the main character felt confident. They had prepared everything carefully, and the truth was clear. The officer suggested that they arrange a meeting with the suspected individual. The main character agreed, knowing that this step needed to be handled delicately. They did not want confrontation in a hostile way. The goal was accountability and to stop the harassment. The authorities would be present, and the evidence would speak for itself. The main character felt a mixture of nerves and anticipation. After weeks of tension, the moment of reckoning was near. The meeting was scheduled in the neighborhood, discreetly, so as not to attract unnecessary attention. The main character arrived early, ensuring the camera footage was easily accessible, and that the mailbox and surrounding area were ready to be examined. They could feel their heart beating faster with each passing minute, but they remained composed. Weeks of patience and preparation had led to this moment. When the suspected individual arrived, they seemed surprised at the formality of the meeting. They had likely expected that the attacks could continue without consequence. The main character remained calm, greeting them politely but firmly. While the officer introduced themselves and outlined the purpose of the meeting, it was clear that the situation was being taken seriously. The main character presented the evidence. Starting with the footage from the hidden camera, the video showed the individual approaching the mailbox, bending it, and scattering letters repeatedly. There was no ambiguity. The camera angles, the timestamps, and the pattern of the attacks all demonstrated deliberate and repeated harassment. The main character spoke clearly, without emotion. Letting the evidence speak for itself, the individual initially tried to deny it, claiming it must have been someone else or that it had been an accident. But as the officer played multiple clips, showing the attacks from different angles and on different days, the denial became increasingly difficult. The main character calmly pointed out details from the footage, the posture, the clothing, the timing of the attacks. The evidence was too strong to dispute. The officer asked the person directly if they had been responsible for the mailbox damage. After a moment of hesitation, the truth came out. The individual admitted to the attacks, though they tried to downplay them as a joke or harmless fun. The main character remained composed, listening carefully, and allowed the officer to handle the conversation. It was important that the admission was official and recorded, so that there could be no further dispute. With the admission and the evidence in hand, the officer explained the consequences. The individual would be responsible for repairing the mailbox, paying fines for the damage, and potentially facing additional penalties if the harassment continued. The main character felt a quiet satisfaction. They had not sought revenge, but justice. The repeated harassment had been stopped, accountability had been established, and the peace of their home could finally be restored. After the meeting, the main character returned home and checked the mailbox carefully. It was intact, standing as it had before the attacks began. For the first time in weeks, they felt a sense of relief. The weeks of observation, preparation, and patience had paid off. The attacks were over, and the person responsible had been held accountable. It was a small victory, but a meaningful one. The experience left the main character reflecting on the lessons learned. They had been tested in ways they had not anticipated, faced ongoing frustration, and dealt with anxiety that crept into daily life. Yet, through careful planning, patience, and persistence, they had turned the situation around. They had moved from being a passive victim to an empowered, prepared, and strategic individual. Over the next few days, the neighborhood returned to its usual rhythm. Neighbors noticed the calm, the absence of incidents, and the restored peace. The main character, quietly proud, did not boast or make a scene. They had acted with integrity, patience, and strategy. The mailbox, now reinforced and undisturbed, became a symbol of their resilience. The main character also took steps to ensure that the situation could not repeat. They reinforced security measures, installed additional cameras in discrete locations, and maintained careful records of any unusual activity. They had learned that vigilance, combined with preparation, was the best way to prevent future harassment. They were not paranoid, but they were prepared. Reflecting on the entire experience, the main character realized how much personal growth had come from it. The repeated attacks had forced them to be observant, patient, and strategic. They had learned to manage frustration, control emotional reactions, and focus on evidence rather than assumptions. They had discovered an inner strength they had not fully appreciated before. The individual responsible for the attacks faced consequences. But the main character did not dwell on anger or resentment. They understood that the person's behavior had likely stemmed from jealousy, boredom, or a desire for control. The important thing was that the situation had been addressed fairly and effectively. Justice had been served without unnecessary conflict or escalation. As the days turned into weeks, the main character began to enjoy their mornings again. They could walk to the mailbox without anxiety, retrieve their letters without fear, and enjoy the calm of their neighborhood. The tension that had once hung over them like a cloud had lifted, replaced by a sense of security and accomplishment. The experience also strengthened their sense of community. They realized how important it was to be aware of one's surroundings, to support neighbors, and to act calmly and strategically in the face of conflict. They had seen how rumors, assumptions, and impulsive reactions could make a situation worse. And they had chosen a different path, one of careful observation, preparation, and patience. Looking back, the The main character could see the entire situation as a story of resilience and quiet strength. What had started as a minor annoyance, a simple act of vandalism, had grown into a challenge that tested their patience, focus, and strategic thinking. Yet, they had faced it with determination, and ultimately, they had prevailed. The mailbox, now standing firm, was more than just a functional object. It was a symbol of persistence, evidence of careful planning, and a reminder that even small challenges could be overcome with patience, intelligence, and calm action. The main character knew that life would continue to present obstacles, but they had learned a valuable lesson, that preparation, observation, and integrity could turn frustration into empowerment. In the end, the main character had not only resolved the situation with the mailbox, but had also grown personally. They had learned to face conflict without impulsiveness, to gather evidence before acting, and to approach challenges with strategy rather than emotion. They had learned the value of patience, careful planning, and resilience. The neighborhood continued its quiet rhythm, unaware of the careful investigation, the preparation, and the final confrontation that had taken place. The main character, now calm and composed, could enjoy the simple pleasures of their home without fear or anxiety. They could walk to the mailbox each morning, collect their letters, and feel a sense of peace that had been absent for too long. And though the attacks had caused frustration and anxiety, they had also brought an unexpected gift, a deeper understanding of personal strength, strategy, and patience. The main character had faced weeks of challenge and had emerged stronger, wiser, and more confident. They had proven that calm, careful action could overcome harassment, and that justice could be achieved without losing one's integrity. The mailbox, standing firm at the end of the driveway, was a quiet reminder of the journey they had taken. It represented weeks of frustration, determination, careful observation, and ultimately, resolution. It was a small object, but it carried a story of resilience, patience, and the power of strategic thinking. As life returned to normal, the main character felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The situation had been handled carefully, the culprit had been confronted, and the neighborhood had regained its calm. The lessons learned, the patience practiced, and the careful planning employed had all contributed to a successful resolution. The experience would remain in the main character's memory as a story of persistence and empowerment. What had started as repeated attacks on a mailbox had become a test of patience, strategy, and personal strength. And in the end, it had been won not through anger or revenge, but through careful planning, observation, and integrity. The main character knew that life would bring new challenges, but they had proven to themselves that they were capable of facing them. They had turned frustration into preparation, anxiety into observation, and repeated harassment into a lesson in resilience. And as they retrieved their letters each morning, the mailbox now standing firm and undisturbed, they could smile quietly, knowing that patience, evidence, and calm action had delivered the last laugh. After weeks of frustration, careful planning, and patient observation, the main character finally felt a sense of closure. The repeated attacks on the mailbox, which had once caused anxiety and tension, had come to an end. The person responsible had been confronted, held accountable, and the neighborhood had returned to its usual calm. But even as the immediate threat disappeared, the main character found that the experience had left a deeper mark, lessons about patience, strategy, and personal resilience that would stay with them long after the mailbox had been repaired. The morning after the final confrontation, the main character stepped outside with a quiet sense of anticipation. The mailbox stood firm at the end of the driveway, reinforced and undisturbed. The morning air was crisp, the sun shining over the rooftops. And for the first time in weeks, they could walk to the mailbox without a sense of dread. Collecting the letters, they felt a strange mix of relief and satisfaction. The ordeal was over, and they had emerged stronger, wiser, and more confident. Reflecting on the events, the main character realized how much had changed in their own approach to challenges. What had started as a small nuisance, a few dents in a mailbox, had grown into weeks of careful observation, note-taking, and strategic thinking. They had learned to control frustration, to channel anxiety into preparation, to act thoughtfully rather than impulsively. The situation had tested their patience in ways they had never imagined, but it had also revealed an inner strength they had not fully appreciated before.